the air in the camp smelled of wet wool, burnt barley, and something deeper the metallic tang of fear held too long in the throat. It was April 1945, and spring had arrived, not with blossoms, but with mud. Endless mud that clung to boots and hemlines like a second skin. We stood in uneven rows near the wire fence, the kind that still carried shards of barbed reminders from winter's last frost. Dawn had just cracked the eastern sky into pale strips of rose and ash, but no one spoke. Not yet. We had learned silence the way others learned scripture. Through repetition, through punishment, through the quiet unraveling of everything we once believed about dignity, I remember the way the British officer walked, not marched, but walked across the open yard. His boots clicked softly against the packed earth, each step deliberate, unhurried, as though he owned not just the ground beneath him, but also the breath we were holding. He wore no helmet, only a peaked cap tilted just so, and his coat, though regulation, looked newly pressed, impossibly clean. He stopped 10 paces from our line, hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning us not with pity, not with contempt, but with the detached appraisal of a man inspecting livestock before a sale. "Ladies," he began, his voice calm, almost gently yet carrying across the yard with the precision of a broadcast signal tuned just right. "You've been through enough." A murmur rippled through us, not of words, but of shifting shoulders, of hands tightening around thin shawls or the frayed edges of coats that had once belonged to brothers or husbands. Long gone. Enough. The word hung in the air, like smoke, visible, suffocating, but impossible to grasp. What was enough? The hunger that gnawed like rats in the ribs, the nights spent listening to the coughs of women slowly dissolving into pneumonia, the rumors whispered in the latrine lines about, repatriation trains heading east, into zones where women vanished like fog over the Elba. "You are not prisoners, in the strictest sense," he continued, glancing toward the guard tower where a sentry stood motionless, rifle slung but ready. "But neither are you free, and with the collapse of your government, with the chaos spreading through what remains of your homeland, well, the Allies cannot guarantee your safety beyond these fences, not indefinitely." Epauset 10, letting the implications sink in the unspoken arithmetic of post-war logistics. Too many but too few rations. Too little room in a world already overflowing with ruins. Someone behind me sniffled, quickly stifled. I kept my eyes on his boots. Polished leather, probably shined that morning with the same care a priest might give to his chalice. "But there is," he said, lowering his voice just slightly, "an alternative, a breath caught somewhere to my left. Mine, maybe." The word alternative was a loaded cartridge in those days, preceding something that sounded like mercy but tasted like iron. He shifted his weight, turned slightly as if addressing the wind itself. "The British Army, like all armies, is composed largely of men. Young men, many of them stationed here for months, some for years. They have done their duty. They deserve stability, companionship, a life beyond barracks and patrols." He looked directly at us now, his gaze sweeping the line like a searchlight. "And you have skills. You speak German, yes, but many of you also speak French, English, even Russian. You can sew, cook, manage a household. You understand discipline, and I suspect you understand loss." A dryness spread through my mouth. I swallowed, but there was nothing left to swallow. "Here is the offer," he said, voice firming. "Any woman among you who agrees to marry a British soldier, an E-soldier approved by command, of course will be granted immediate release from the camp. Full ration status, housing, legal protection under British jurisdiction, a new identity, if necessary. Children, should they come, will be British citizens." He let that settle. Somewhere, a crow cawed from the skeletal branches of a beech tree beyond the fence. The word marry hung in the air like a trapdoor waiting to drop. Not work for, not serve, not assist. Marry? As though love could be bartered, as though vows could be ration cards stamped with victory ink. "You will not be forced," he added quickly, perhaps sensing the tremor running through our ranks. This is entirely voluntary. But consider it carefully. The alternative remaining here, or worse, being transferred to a displaced persons camp in the Soviet sector is not one I would wish upon any woman who has already endured so much. He stepped back then, giving us space but not time. Time was the one commodity he knew we didn't have. The sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers toward us, pulling at our hems, our collars, our resolve. I looked at the women around me, Greet, whose brother had died at Stalingrad, and who hadn't smiled since 1942. Barely 19, who'd been conscripted into a munitions factory at 16, and whose hands still bore the chemical stains of cordite. Frau Weber, widow of a Wehrmacht major, now reduced to trading buttons for crusts of bread. Each face was a map of survival. Every line, a record of choices made in darkness. What would it mean to say yes? To walk out of this mud and wire into a strange man's house, to share his bed, his name, his silence, to become Frau Smith or Mrs. Davies, to learn to make tea properly, to fold your accent like a handkerchief and tuck it deep in your pocket. Was that freedom or another cage, gilded with rations and painted in Union Jack colors? And if you said no, you stayed. You waited. You watched the rations shrink further, the medicine vanish, the guards grow colder. You prayed the Soviets never came for you. You prayed harder that the Americans wouldn't send you back east for processing. The officer turned to leave, his polished heels sinking slightly into the mud, just enough to leave a mark. You have until tomorrow morning, he said without looking back. One representative will speak for all. Then he was gone, swallowed by the low barracks behind the admin block, leaving us alone with the rising sun, the crow's call, and a question wrapped in a wedding band. What is your body worth when your country has nothing left to sell? No one moved, not yet. But I could feel it, the slow, seismic shift beneath our feet, not of earth, but of something far more fragile. The line between survival and surrender, blurring like ink in rain. Dawn, the next day, arrived with a cruel kind of clarity. The mist had burned off early, leaving the camp stark and exposed beneath a sky scrubbed clean of clouds. We gathered again, near the fence knot, in the same formation, not with the same silence but with a strange, thrumming energy, like the moment before a wire snaps under tension. No one had slept. Not truly. The night had been a slow tide of whispers. Arguments choked back before they could rise, fingers tracing the edges of impossible choices. Some women paced the perimeter of their barracks, arms crossed tight over chests as though holding something in. Others sat rigid on their cots, eyes fixed on nothing, rehearsing words they weren't sure they could speak. I hadn't spoken to anyone, not even Greet, who usually shared my bunk and my bread without a word passing between us. Last night, she'd turned her back to me before the lights went out, and I'd understood this wasn't something we could share, not even in silence. Too much pride, too much shame, too much of the unsaid already coiled between us like barbed wire. By mid-morning, the British officer returned. Same boots, same cap, but something in his posture had shifted. Less certainty. Perhaps, or maybe just the weariness of a man who'd begun to suspect his solution might not be as tidy as his superiors had hoped. He didn't address us directly this time. Instead, he nodded to a junior lieutenant standing nearby, who then called out a single name, Anna Vogel. A ripple went through the line, not because Anna was unknown. She'd been among us since January, but because she'd spoken barely 10 words in all that time. A schoolteacher from Königsberg, or so rumor had it. Quiet, pale, always folding and refolding the same handkerchief, as if trying to shape it into something solid. She stepped forward slowly, shoulders narrow beneath a coat 2 sizes too large. Her hair was pinned back so tightly it pulled the skin around her eyes, taut, giving her a look of perpetual surprise. I'd seen her once, weeks ago, helping Frau Weber stitch a tear in her skirt, fingers quick and sure. She hadn't looked up then, either. Now, standing before the officer, she did, not defiantly, not meekly but with a stillness that seemed to drain the noise from the yard. Even the wind held its breath. The lieutenant held out a clipboard. "You've been selected by consensus," he asked, voice clipped, but not unkind. Anna nodded once. No words. Just the barest tilt of her chin. The officer stepped forward. "Very well. Very well, then you'll convey the group's decision." Anna didn't look at us. She kept her eyes fixed on him, as though memorizing the shape of his face for a report she'd never file. And then she spoke. Not in the hesitant German of someone afraid of consequences, but in clear, precise, English-accented, yes, but fluent, almost musical in its cadence. "We thank you," she began, and for a heartbeat. Hope flickered in the officer's expression, just the faintest softening around the eyes. He'd expected resistance, perhaps, but surely not gratitude. Surely not cooperation, wrapped in courtesy. But Anna wasn't finished. "We thank you," she repeated, "for offering us a choice. But it is not a choice. It is a transaction, and we are not currency." A gasp rill, this time, escaped someone behind me. Not of shock, but of release, as if a wire deep inside had finally snapped and let something long buried pour out. The officer blinked. "I assure you, Miss Vogel, no coercion is intended." "No," Anna interrupted, voice still calm, but now edged with something sharper steel wrapped in silk. "You present marriage as shelter, as salvation, but you do not ask if we wish to be wives. You ask if we wish to survive, and in doing so, you make love a condition of life. That is not generosity. That is arithmetic." She paused, hands still clasped around the handkerchief. It was trembling now, hoosed slightly. "My mother," she said, quieter, "married for love. She died in a bombing raid in 43, clutching my father's photograph. My sister married for security, a party official with connections. She vanished in 44. I do not know which was worse, to die believing in something true, or to live serving something false." The yard was utterly silent. Even the guards had stopped shifting their weight. "So no," Anna said, lifting her chin fully now, meeting the officer's gaze without flinching. "We will not marry your soldiers. Not for rations. Not for papers. Not even for a roof that doesn't leak. Because what you offer is not a future. It is a surrender dressed in a wedding veil." She turned then slowly, deliberately, and walked back toward us. Not with triumph, not with anger, but with the exhausted grace of someone who has just carried a truth too heavy for one person to bear. And as she passed between us, woman after woman reached out, not to touch her, but to make physical space, as if her words had carved a new kind of ground beneath our feet. The officer stood frozen for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, not with his earlier certainty, but with the stiff gait of a man who just realized he'd mistaken desperation for docility. That afternoon, the rations didn't come. Nor the next day. No explanation was given. But something had changed in the air, not just the absence of hope, but the presence of something harder, clearer. We hadn't won freedom. Not yet. But we'd refused to trade our dignity for the illusion of safety. And in that refusal, for the first time since the war ended, we felt something close to whole. That night, Greet sat beside me on the bunk. She didn't speak. She just placed a small lump of sugar hoarded for weeks into my palm and closed my fingers around it. A gift, not a transaction. And in the dark, I understood. This was our resistance now, not with guns or codes, but with the quiet, unyielding act of saying no when the world demanded yes. The days that followed were strange, not easier, but altered, as if the air itself had been recalibrated. The British didn't punish us overtly. No extra roll calls. No harsher curfews. No sudden transfers. But the silence from the administration block grew heavier, more deliberate. Rations remained thin, but now they came without eye contact, without the perfunctory "Good morning, ladies" we'd once received from the junior guards. We had become inconvenient. Not dangerous, never that, but inconvenient, in the way truth often is. Impossible to ignore, yet impossible to integrate into the neat narratives of post-war order. Still, something had shifted within us. The shared refusal Anna's words, spoken for Allah, had stitched us together with a new kind of thread. Not the brittle solidarity of shared suffering, but the tougher weave of collective dignity. Women who had once hoarded scraps or traded gossip now shared blankets without being asked. Liesel began teaching children's songs to the younger girls, not Nazi marching tunes, but old folk melodies her grandmother had sung in the Black Forest. Melodies that carried no ideology, only memory. Frau Weber started a ledger, not of debts, but of names. Every woman in the camp, her hometown, her trade, the names of her lost. So we are not forgotten, she said, even if the world forgets us. I found myself watching Anna more closely. She never spoke of that morning again. She walked with the same quiet precision, folded her handkerchief with the same meticulous care. But now, when she passed through the yard, women would pause their tasks and offer a nod, not reverence, not deference, but acknowledgement, as if to say, I saw what you did. I am still here because of it. Then, in early May, a new vehicle rolled through the gate, a staff car, not a lorry. From it stepped a man in civilian clothes, accompanied by 2 British officers in dress uniform. He was older, silver-haired, with spectacles perched low on his nose and a leather satchel slung over one shoulder like a priestess stole. He introduced himself as Mr. Hargreaves, from the Ministry of Labor, on special assignment. No one believed him, not Antirelli. In a world where every official title masked another agenda, special assignment could mean anything. Repatriation, interrogation, He requested a private meeting with Anna. She refused. If you speak to one of us, she said, standing at the door of Barrack 3, you speak to all. To our surprise, he agreed. That afternoon, we gathered in the mess hall, what passed for one. Anyway, long wooden benches, a rusted stove in the corner, walls still bearing the ghostly outlines of propaganda posters hastily scraped away. Mr. Hargreaves stood at the front, not behind a podium, but with his hands clasped before him, as if in mild apology. I am not here to offer marriage, he began, and a ripple of dry laughter passed through the room, bitter, brief, but real. Nor am I here to assign blame. The war has ended, but its aftermath is untidy. And in untidy times, governments look for solutions that appear clean. He paused, glancing at his notes. Your refusal has been noted. Not hysteri, but in London. It as caused. Discussion. A murmur stirred. Not fear this time, but something closer to wary curiosity. Because of that, he continued, a new option is being considered. Not marriage, not imprisonment, but work. Skilled work. The British zone requires clerks, translators, nurses, mechanics, women who can rebuild, not just survive. Those selected would be relocated to supervised housing in Hanover or Bremen, paid in Reichsmarks, an Allied occupation currency, with access to medical care and weekly mail privileges. He looked up. It is not freedom, but it is movement, and it is earned not through vows, but through labor. Silence again. But this time, it was different. This wasn't a gilded cage wrapped in lace. This was work, the thing we knew, the thing we could do without selling our names or our nights. Anna stepped forward. Supervised by whom? She asked. British military administrators, with oversight from the newly forming German civilian councils. And if we refuse this, too? Mr. Hargreaves sighed. Then you remain here until repatriation orders are finalized, which, given the current chaos in the East, could be months, possibly longer. He didn't threaten. He simply stated the truths, the same truth we'd already tasted in the thin broth and thinner blankets. That night, we debated in hushed circles, not in factions, not in panic, but in careful, weary voices. Was this truly different? Or just coercion wearing a different coat? Greet argued that work was dignity. Liesel feared Hanover too close to the Soviet line. Frau Weber pointed out that even supervised housing meant windows that opened, floors that didn't flood, the chance to send a letter that might actually reach its destination. By dawn, we had our answer. Not unanimous, but clear enough. Anna returned to the mess hall, where Mr. Hargreaves waited with his satchel and his quiet demeanor. "We will accept," she said, "on 3 conditions." He raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. First, no separation of families. Any woman with children goes with them, housed together. He nodded slowly, agreed. Second, no religious or political vetting. We are not to be judged by who we once saluted, but by what we can do now. Another nod, noted. Third, Anna said, voice dropping just enough that those at the back leaned forward. We choose our own representatives, not you, not your officers. Us to speak for us if another offer comes. This time, Mr. Hargreaves hesitated. Then, after a long breath, he extended his hand. Accepted? No one cheered. No one hugged. But as we filed out of the mess hall that morning, something invisible had loosened in our chests, not the weight of captivity. Not yet, but the constant, grinding fear that we would be erased, one compromise at a time. In the days that followed, lists were drawn, skills catalogued, mothers identified, and for the first time since the gates closed behind us, we filled out forms not as prisoners, not as penitents, but as women with names, traits, and the stubborn will to define ourselves. Even the mud outside seemed less suffocating. It was still there, still clinging, but now it was just earth, not a boundary, not a sentence, just earth waiting for seeds. By late May, the first transport left the camp under a sky heavy with the promise of rain that never fell. 12 women, including Liesel and Frau Weber, boarded a converted ambulance, painted in faded khaki, their belongings wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string. No fanfare, no farewell speeches, just the creak of suspension, the low murmur of the engine, and the dust rising behind them like a ghost reluctant to let go. Anna stayed. She'd been offered a position in Hanover as a translator, but she declined. Someone must remain. She told me the night before the departure to ensure they keep their word. I didn't ask what she meant, whether she feared betrayal, or simply understood that trust, once broken, needed constant tending. Life in the camp settled into a new rhythm, quieter but more purposeful. Those of us who remained were no longer waiting. We were preparing mending uniforms for future clerks, inventorying medical supplies salvaged from abandoned Wehrmacht depots, practicing English phrases in low voices during roll call. Even the guards seemed less like jailers and more like reluctant custodians of an ending they didn't fully understand. One evening, a young private slipped me a tin of corned beef from my mum, he muttered, eyes fixed on the horizon, and walked away before I could thank him. It wasn't kindness. Not exactly. It was acknowledgement, and in those days, acknowledgement was rarer than food. Then, in early June, a letter arrived, not through official channels, but tucked into the pocket of a returning supply driver who'd passed through Bremen. It was addressed to Anna in careful script, sealed with red wax, stamped with a crude flower. Inside, a single sheet of paper, written in German but bearing English postal marks. Asterisk. We have rooms with real windows. The stove works. Liesel teaches arithmetic to 3 girls whose mothers work in the laundry. Frau Weber tends a small garden parsley. Radishes 1 stubborn rose. They pay us every Friday. No one asks about our pasts unless we offer. We are not free, but we are not forgotten. Anna read it once, then folded it and placed it inside her copy of Siddhartha, which she kept beneath her mattress. She didn't share the contents, but that night she allowed herself a rare smile brief, almost involuntarious. She stirred beet soup over the communal fire. It was more than enough. Still, The world beyond the fence continued its uneven reckoning. Rumors reached us of mass expulsions from the east, of women walking for weeks with nothing but a child on their back and a photograph in their shoe, of Soviet camps where denazification meant something far darker, and of British officers elsewhere repeating the same offer we had, refused, sometimes accepted, sometimes not. We heard of a camp near Lüneburg where 16 women married soldiers in a single week, another near Hamburg where the proposal sparked a riot, ending in tear gas and solitary confinement. There was no universal response, only choices made in the narrow spaces between survival and self. And then, one afternoon in July, the gates opened not for a transport, but for visitors. 2 women civilian dressed, carrying satchels and notebooks accompanied by a British liaison. They introduced themselves as researchers from the Women's Bureau of the Allied Reconstruction Committee. They wanted to document the female experience in post-war transition. At first, we were wary. Documentation had often preceded judgment. But these women, Aluna from Manchester, Ingrid from Oslo, sat with us, not as interrogators, but as witnesses. They listened. They took notes without interrupting. And when Greet broke down describing the night her village was strafed by American fighters, a wedding procession for a troop convoy, they didn't offer platitudes. They simply handed her a clean handkerchief and waited. It was during those interviews that Anna finally told her full story, not just about her mother and sister, but about her work before the war. Teaching literature to girls who dreamed of becoming writers, architects, pilots. We read Goethe, she said, voice steady, but also Woolf. We believed stories could change the world. She paused. Now I wonder if they can only remind us what we've lost. Eleanor wrote that down. Not as data, but as testament. By August, the camp population had halved. The remaining women were either too ill to travel, too young without guardians, or, like Anna and me, too stubborn to leave until every last name on Frau Weber's ledger had been accounted for. The British, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of bureaucratic exhaustion, granted us a small office in the admin blocker room with a desk, a typewriter, and a window that actually opened. We used it to cross-reference missing persons reports with repatriation manifests, to write letters for women who couldn't form the words, to keep the fragile thread of identity from snapping entirely. One evening, as dusk turned the wire fence into a lattice of shadow, I found Anna standing by that window, watching a train pass on the distant horizon heading west, lights flickering like distant stars. "Do you ever regret saying no?" I asked quietly. She didn't turn. "Regret is a luxury," she said. "We didn't choose a better life. We chose to remain ourselves. That's not noble. It's just necessary." Outside, the train whistle sounded long, low, mournful. Somewhere, a woman began singing an old lullaby, voice thin but clear. Not a song of victory, not a hymn of surrender, just a voice, rising in the twilight, refusing to be silenced. And in that moment, I understood. Our resistance hadn't ended with a refusal. It continued in every letter sent, every name preserved, every quiet act of remembrance that insisted we were more than the war had tried to make us. Not heroes, not victims, just women still here, still speaking, still stitching our dignity back together, one thread at a time.